Okay, this week we're going to be looking at meaning of mitzvot. Oh, this is not recording. Yes, we are recording. Okay, great. This week's meaning of mitzvot, we're looking at mitzvah 230. It's a negative prohibition not to delay paying wages. Before I start, actually, I'm happy at the end if anyone has any suggestions of any other mitzvot they'd like to discuss in these sessions. I'm more than happy to take any suggestions. You either tell me at the end or message me. More than happy. Okay, so I thought this week we'd look at, and again, I tried to make connections with the weekly parsha, although there are no mitzvot actually in the rest of Bereshit, but there are things that we can derive from. So this week we're going to be reading about Yaakov and Lavan, his father-in-law, who defrauded him a number of times. And the words ganav, meaning to steal or a thief, is mentioned a number of times in this week's parsha. So I thought we'd look at the prohibition of stealing, of theft, of robbery, and also this idea of not to delay paying wages. And we'll see something very interesting, because in Parshas Kedoshim, so source number 1, in Vayikra chapter 19, verse 13, it says, Lo tashoches re'acha v'lo tigzol, you should not defraud your friend, nor should you steal from them. Lo salin pulat sachir itzacha ad boker, the wages of a laborer you shall not retain with you until the morning. Okay, so it's fairly straightforward. So we seem to have 3 different things here. You mustn't defraud someone. So you mustn't cheat somebody out of something that's rightfully theirs. You should not commit robbery. So you should not forcibly take property from somebody else. We make a distinction between Geneva and Gezela. Geneva is to steal. Gezela is, in English, also there's a distinction. There is theft and robbery. Robbery is normally theft, including an element of violence involved. And then finally, to pay your workers on time, you must not delay paying somebody until the morning. So if somebody has worked, and the Gemara talks about here, because there's another source in Parshas Kitetse in Devarim that talks about this, and the Gemara makes a distinction. It says here we're talking about a person who's hired to work for the day. So a day worker who expects an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. At the end of the day, they expect to be paid. The Torah says you must pay them. You cannot retain their wages until the morning, even if they're going to come back in the morning and work for you another day. And you say to them, I'll pay you double tomorrow. You're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to delay their payment until the next day. You must not keep it all night. So let's just try to understand those 3 different things and why they are put together. So we look at some of the classic commentaries on that pasuk. The Ibn Ezra tells us, what does this mean? The first part of the pasuk, Lo tashoch es re'acha, you should not defraud your friend. But say he says one word, covertly, secretly, which is normally what fraud is. Fraud is theft, which involves an element of deception. Okay, so that's the first thing. So that's theft using deception. Then we've got theft using violence. Here we're talking about gezel is, as I said, gezela is openly with force. So there are different ways you can actually remove property or money that belongs to other people. One is without knowing of it, defrauding them. Another is doing it openly, forcing them to hand the money over to you. So we have 2 different types, and that's what the verse is talking about. Both of them are obviously forbidden. And then the third thing, another commentary says, so the third part of the verse, which is, you must not allow the wages of a worker to remain with you until the morning. He says, for example, you're not allowed to say to this person, you say to him, I'm not going to pay you until day 5. So you're working for me every single day. You're going to work for me 5 days a week. I'll pay you at the end of the week. You're not allowed to do that, because this person expects or needs, as we're going to see, needs to be paid every single day. You know, it's what they say, hand to mouth. Yeah, this person lives hand to mouth. At the end of the day's work, they need the money in order to buy food for themselves and their family. So you can't, even if they're to work for you for a whole week, you cannot say to them, I'll pay you at the end of the week. Very interesting. There's no greater robbery than this, no greater theft than this. Because this person doesn't have anything to eat. Who knows and this is a quotation from the verse in Devarim in Kitetse that says the similar idea, takes the similar prohibition. It says, because upon him, this person, he's carrying his soul, meaning this person is desperate. They need this money on a daily basis, and therefore to withhold it from them, says the Bechor Shor, there's no greater theft than that. That's a very powerful statement. Okay, so let's now define a little bit more these three prohibitions. Let's take the first two, and we look at the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, which lists every single of the mitzvahs, and there's a negative prohibition listed as 157. He says, so there's no English translation to this one, I'm afraid. He says, Mitzvah Skuf Nun Vav, so Mitzvah 156 and 157, Katov Parshas Kedoshim, Lo Tashokes Re'echa Lo Tigzol. It says you should not defraud your friend, nor should you steal from them. Says the Gemara, or ask the Gemara, Ezehu Gozel Zeh. What type of theft is this? Are we talking about? So it answers, Halokech Mamon Chaver B'Chazaka. So this idea of Lo Tigzol, as we saw in Ibn Ezra, is taking money from somebody else with force. Kugon, Shechataf Metaltalin Miyado. For example, you snatch possessions from their hand. It doesn't literally have to be in their hand, but you forcibly remove possessions from them. Or Shnichnas Rushutoy Shlo Bratson Habalim. V'natal Kelim Misham. Or, for example, you trespass on their property without their permission, and you take movable objects from it. Or, or, for example, you make use of his servants or his animals, again without their permission. Or you go into his field and you eat his produce, anything that's similar to that. So this is taking other people's property either by force or without their permission, completely brazen and without any concern for the other person. That's Lo Tigzol. That's the prohibition of Lo Tigzol. And Ezehu Oshek, what is this Oshek we say, the first part of the verse, Lo Tashokes Re'echa, you should not defraud him. He says, Ezehu Oshek, Zeh Sheba Mamon Chavera Liyado B'Ratzon Habalim. Here, you take money from your friend and they give it to you willingly. But your intention is not to return it to them. They're giving it to you willingly, thinking you're going to at some point return it to them. But your intention is not to return it to them. Or for example, your friend has in their hand a deposit or a loan or schirus or money for hiring, and you take hold of it, you hold on to it. And he has no recourse to law to extract it from you. So you found a way that he can't prove in court, in law, that you took it without his permission, because he gave it to you with permission. But you did it in such a way which he can't get it back from you. Even though this is obvious that you can't do this, as Rabbi says, and he quotes in the Gemara where it says in Bava Mitzvah, Zehu Oshek. This is called Oshek, Zehu Gezel, and it's also called Gezel. He says it's one and the same thing. This clever fraud is theft by a different name, but it is theft nevertheless. Don't think to yourself, well, actually, I'm not stealing from this person because they gave it to me willingly, and it's their own fault that they can't retrieve it. No, this is theft. This is all different types of theft. So the question you could ask is, and it goes on to say, well, therefore, why does the Torah betray Lishnu? Why does the Torah spell it out in two different ways? Why does it say, Lo tashoker esechav lo tigzol? Why does it say you shouldn't defraud and you shouldn't steal? If you're saying they're one and the same thing, why mention them separately? And he answers, La'avo alav b'shnei lavim. In order to make known that a person who does either of these two things would commit two separate transgressions and therefore be liable separately for them, for both. You couldn't say, well, I defrauded X and I stole openly from Y. I'm guilty of theft. No. You're guilty of theft for having stolen from X, and you're guilty of theft a second time for stealing from Y. Even though they're different types of theft, they are theft nevertheless and are treated separately. Okay, so there we have the definition from this verse. We have Lo Tashok, which is theft by means of fraud. Lo tigzol is theft by means of force. And then we have this third idea of delaying payment to a worker. Let's have a look a bit more deeply in terms of the meaning of this. We turn to the Or HaChaim. Now, the Or HaChaim is another classic commentary on the Torah. And here he moves away slightly from the simple explanation of the verse. He says something very interesting. So now we're looking at the third part of the verse. Lo tashok es re'acha. You shall not oppress your... sorry, this is the first part of the verse, sorry. Do not oppress your fellow, meaning do not defraud them. So he says the following. After the Torah had forbidden the acquisition of someone else's money through theft, a person might conclude that the Torah's objection is only to thievery and not to other ways of appropriating something which is rightfully someone else's. This is why the Torah had to outlaw the obtaining of money by someone exploiting his position of strength vis-a-vis a person whose social or financial position places him at a disadvantage. The prohibition includes withholding wages of a laborer even only for one night. So it's very interesting what he's saying is, see, even though the Torah has already told us, it's in the Aseret HaDibros, in the Ten Commandments, you mustn't steal. Lo signoiv, you mustn't steal. Why does the Torah here in Parshas Kedoshim, now in Vayikra, have to repeat that in slightly different terminology? If we know theft is wrong in whatever forms. Says the Or HaChaim that the Torah is trying to make a really important point here, which is, a person shouldn't deceive themselves into thinking theft of one type is forbidden, but theft of another type, I'm not stealing from them, I'm merely taking full advantage of my superior position over them. Yeah, that I have, and somehow this person has willingly parted with their money, and okay, their fault. Buyer beware, or whatever those phrases are. Unfortunately, there are many scams out there, particularly nowadays, and then with the internet and all these things. Who hasn't had an email from a Nigerian prince promising them millions of pounds? All they have to do is transfer £1,000 to their account. Yeah, many people unfortunately have been a victim of that sort of thing. A person shouldn't think, well, that's their fault. No, we have a responsibility not to take advantage of our position and other people's weaknesses. That's the first thing. So that's really interesting. Second paragraph, he goes on to says, the reason, now the next question he asks is the thing. Let's look back at the verse. The verse says, Lo ta'ashok es re'acha. Now, re'acha, someone put a question in the chat, does this only apply to Jews? Well, this particular prohibition is specific to your fellow Jews, because the word here is re'acha. Re'acha means a re'ah is a friend. And when we talk about friends, we talk about fellow Jews. Now, that doesn't say that it's permitted to go and defraud non-Jews. Absolutely not. Theft is always theft. It comes under a different category, though. Here we're talking specifically from a fellow Jew. But the question is, why does it say you shouldn't defraud a friend, your fellow? Why? Again, it's very unlikely that people defraud their friends. Why? That's not a very good friend if you go around defrauding them. So why couch it in the language of friend? So the Or HaChaim answers, the reason the Torah describes the injured party as a re'ah, as a friend, a colleague, or a friend, is to warn us not to presume on the other party's friendship towards us to shortchange him in what is due to them. One must not play loose with a friend's money because he is one's friend, and presumably will not voice his objection for the sake of preserving the friendship. So very interesting. Again, a person could deceive themselves and think, well, yes, I did trick this person, but if they had a problem with it, they'd say something to me. No, you can't assume that this person, the reason why you got away with what you got away with is because they're your friend, because they don't want to damage the relationship with you. They haven't said anything, but that doesn't give you license to be, as he said, play fast and loose with their money and take advantage of that friendship. That is totally not permitted, and that is why there's a separate prohibition for that. That's why it says re'acha, your friend. Don't think because they are your friend that there's no problem with what you're doing. And then he goes on and says, the word es re'acha is justified seeing the subject is one which involves only people, not God directly. Moreover, if the friend forgives the harm done to him, such behavior is not considered a sin vis-a-vis God. I think what he's saying there is that this is although this would appear theft, you might think is a prohibition between you and God. So God tells us do not steal. Here actually saying this is actually a civil matter. This is about civility and about interpersonal relationships. That it's saying es re'acha, your friend, because it's between you and other people. It's about this prohibition governs not our relationship with God, but our relationship with our fellow human beings. And that is what that's what we should have in our minds when we consider this prohibition. Having said that, he goes on and says, a moral ethical dimension of these verses is found in the Gemara and Brachos, where the Talmud discusses the verse in Proverbs, where it says, he who robs father or mother, saying it is no sin, is a companion of a destroyer. The Talmud views the verse as referring to someone enjoying the products of this world without first reciting a benediction, bracha, acknowledging that it all belongs to God. Father and mother in that verse are supposed to be God. The concept of the people of Israel commonly referred to as Knesset Israel.
Yes.
Yeah? The word Re'acha in our verse would refer to God himself.
Yes, Thursday.
Yeah, we are entitled to this homiletical approach based on another verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs, where Solomon warns not to abandon your friend and the friend of your father. This means one should not rob God of what he provides without first acknowledging it, taking permission. So
confirming tomorrow.
Another way of looking at it is that here we're talking about Lo Tashokes Re'acha, that we shouldn't try in some way, not that it's even possible, but we should be conscious of the fact that when we enjoy the blessings in this world, we have to acknowledge the source of those blessings. Just like when a parent teaches their children to say please and thank you. Why? Although the parent is quite happy for the child to take what they want to have and enjoy it, the child needs to acknowledge and be grateful for the source of what they are enjoying. And the same with us. We are God's children, and the right and proper thing to do is for us to acknowledge the source of all the things. If we don't, then it's considered as if we are defrauding God himself. So and then he goes on and says, the reason the Torah adds the words "do not rob" is to tell you that even the positive mitzvah performance contains an element of robbery. Now he's moving on to another really interesting area. So when it says here in the verse, "V'lo exalt," so don't fail to acknowledge God whenever you enjoy the blessings of this world. You have to thank God for everything you've got. The next thing is "V'lo exalt." You mustn't steal from God. How is it possible to steal from God? So he says, the reason the Torah adds the words "do not rob" is to tell you that even the paucity of mitzvah performance contains an element of robbery. When we fail to carry out a mitzvah, which we are obligated to observe, and have the opportunity to observe one causes harm to the entire Jewish people, i.e., one is guilty of transgressing the commandment of lo talin, not performing one's duty on time, the third part of the verse. That's a really interesting thing to say. Yeah, that he's saying that stealing from God, that we have, just like a worker. If a worker is paid to work for you, you expect them to do your work. You don't expect them to spend all the time checking their phone, speaking to their friends, and doing their own work. No, you expect them to do your own work. Now, God expects us to do God's work. Yeah, the mitzvahs. If we fail to do so when we have the opportunity to do so, we are in some way robbing from God, stealing from God. And when the Torah writes, "Do not keep overnight with you the wages due to a laborer," this is a demand to perform daily and punctually in one's mitzvah performances. Yeah, there's a verse there's a mission in Pirkei Avos that says, yeah, that the employer is demanding and the workers are lazy. Yeah, that God expects. Yeah, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Yeah, that God brought us into this world in order to give us his blessings, but he also expects us to maintain the other side of the covenant and the relationship with him by performing mitzvahs. If we fail to do so, then you could see this verse as an allusion to our failure in our performance and this concept of failing to pay a worker on time. He goes on, It says in the Midrash, Vayikra Rabbah describes the practice of day borrowing from night during the summer months, whereas night borrows from day during the winter months. Ideally, both day and night should be 12 hours long, all year long. Sorry, should be 12 hours long all year long. Were it not for the fact that the Earth's axis is nowadays since the deluge at an angle, right? So there should have been an even split between daylight and night. Obviously, there isn't now, as you know, that different times of the year it gets lighter early or darker later, etc., etc. The Midrash presents this as an ideal way of two parties helping each other out without recourse to written contracts, demands for repayments, etc. When the Torah writes, "Lo talin b'ras sachar yitzacha," do not hold back the wages of a laborer with you all night long, the word yitzacha refers back to the word schir, someone hired by God, a reference to the spirit God has granted his laborers, i.e., man. God looks upon man as his hired hand. He has granted this spirit both to the hired hand as well as to the resident. Man's wages are that he is granted the privilege to carry out the commandments of God. Any one of us failing to do so or doing so belatedly harms the whole people. So when you've got a group of people working on a project, if not everybody is pulling their weight, then it has a detrimental effect on the whole project. It affects the other people on it. And here he's saying that this analogy of night borrowing from day, some borrowing from winter, is that there's no contract between night and day, and yet they share, and yet they borrow from each other, and there's no requirements for them to be forced to do so. The ultimate relationship with God is that we do mitzvahs not because we're purely forced to do so, we're expected to do so. We do it because we know that is our responsibility, that we have a responsibility not only to ourselves, but to God and to the entire Jewish people. Each of us is a link in the chain. Each of us makes up this idea of Knesset Yisrael, the congregation of Israel, and we all have to play our part. So I think it's a really fascinating way of looking at that verse. A couple more minutes to look at a couple more sources. The Shlach Kadosh, the Shnei Luchos Bris, in his commentary on this, says the following. The Torah continues with, do not oppress your fellow, your neighbor. Why does the Torah mention it in connection with Re'acha, a term usually employed for someone who is a friend of yours? A similar question as we saw in the Orach Chaim. Why does the Torah add, and do not commit robbery? A report in Brachos appears to allude to our problem. Rav Huna once suffered the loss of 400 barrels of wine, which had all turned sour. Rav Yehuda, brother of Rav Salo the Pious, visited him together with other scholars. They suggested to him that he should examine his past deeds. He says to them, do you suspect me of wrongdoing? And they replied, do you perhaps imply that God is suspected of having caused you such a grievous loss without cause? Thereupon, Rav Huna challenged anyone who had heard something negative about him to say so. They told him that they had heard that it did not give his land tenant certain shoots that the latter was entitled to. To this accusation, Rav Huna retorted that since the land tenant in question had not given him any part of the harvest of that vineyard, how could there be a question of his stealing from the land tenant? I.e., meaning that the tenant had not paid his rent, and therefore Rav Huna felt entitled to withhold something that was due to the tenant because he was at fault for not having paid his rent. In other words, at worst, he had only reimbursed himself partially for what the land tenant had stolen from him. So he felt justified. The rabbis quoted a popular proverb to Rav Huna, which states that if someone steals from a thief, he still tastes the fruit of theft. Rav Huna accepted the rebuke and made restitution. His vinegar then turned to wine again, or according to another version, there was an increase in the price of wine, so he recouped his loss when selling the balance of his stock. Applied to our verse, this means that the Torah calls the person who steals from a thief re'acha, i.e., he puts on him the same moral footing as the thief himself. The Torah adds, and do not commit robbery, to tell us that if we steal from a robber, we too are considered robbers. And again, another fascinating way of looking at it, which is that, it's, the codes amongst thieves, but if you steal from, again, the person could justify themselves and say, well, this person stole from me. I'm only taking back what's rightly mine, and therefore I'm justified in doing so, says the Torah, no. Because it says, Lo tashoch es re'acha, do not defraud your re'acha, your friend, Who is your friend that you are now a thief? He is a friend of yours because he's also a thief. Yes, you're right. He did wrong by stealing from you. But by you now stealing from him, you're just as bad. Your brothers you're now friends. You're now colleagues in theft, in robbery. Therefore, again, persons shouldn't deceive themselves in thinking, again, the old adage, two wrongs don't make a right. Yeah, persons shouldn't think because they wronged me, I can now, in order to retake what's rightfully mine, I can wrong them. No, you have to go use the right recourse in order to restore what's rightfully yours. You cannot resort to theft or defrauding. Okay, and then one or two sources, last two sources. The Shalah says in another place, the second part of our verse, and we'll just see it in English because we haven't got time. Okay, you should not delay. So it says the reason one is not allowed to delay paying wages to a day laborer till the morning following is that God arranges sustenance for each of his creatures, and the laborer in question was allocated these wages by God to use them for his food supply for this very day. By denying him access to this, the employer effectively interfered with God's decree, and the angel appointed to oversee the allocation of sustenance on that day will turn into an accuser against the employer in question. He will be judged as having transgressed a royal decree. The domain which will judge the employer is the attribute of night, an attribute applying justice rigorously. So based on the words, you should not hear when it says meaning overnight. So you'll be judged through the attribute of night, an attribute applying justice rigorously. The Torah in Devarim describes the state of mind of the labor in question in the words, as we saw earlier, Ve'elav who knows es nafshoy, and his life depends upon it. So that is what the Gemara, so the Torah is telling us the reason why you can't hold his payment overnight is because he is dependent upon his life depends on you paying him that day in order that he can feed himself. But I think what he's saying here, the first part is this idea that apart from theft and fraud being wrong in themselves, because again, and as Rav Hirsch would explain, these are mishpatim, these are perfectly logical laws that we can discern for ourselves. So for the smooth functioning of society, people cannot go around withholding payments from other people, defrauding other people, and forcibly taking property from other people that doesn't belong to them. That's quite obvious. We didn't need the Torah to tell us that. But what the Shalai said, the Shnei Luchos HaBris is telling us here is that what a person has to keep in mind is the reason why the Torah sets it out for us is because there's something else going on here. Not only does it interfere with civil society, but it also interferes with the divinely set order. That God arranges sustenance, as he says here, arranges sustenance for each of his creatures, and the labor in question was allocated these wages by God to use them for his food supply every day. That God had discerned that this person was deserving of X amount of X payment on day Y. For you to say, oh, by the way, no, I'm going to pay you tomorrow or at the end of the week, you are interfering in God's running of this world. Now, a person might think, well, it's up to me how I deal in financial matters. Says the Shlah, no. Yeah, that is the incorrect attitude. The proper attitude you must have is the reason why I have this money, the reason why I'm able to employ somebody is because God has allowed it to happen. Just as much as the reason why God has allowed this person to have this work is because they need it, and therefore they need their money at the end of the day. Who are we to say, I know better? No, don't worry about God's plans. I've got other plans. That is the deeper meaning behind this mitzvah. And then we'll just finish off with the Sefer HaChinuch, who lists actually under the mitzvah 228, the explanation of this matter. And the main reason, according to my opinion, is from two angles. The reason why it has these three mitzvahs of negative prohibitions of not defrauding, not stealing, and not delaying payments. He says the first one is that in everything in everything that God, blessed be, he wants to distance us from a great distancing for our good. I'll summarize because we're running out of time. The question is, as we saw earlier, as the Gemara asked, if all of this comes under the prohibition of theft, All of this is forbidden because it's stealing from someone in one way or another. Defrauding is theft. Robbery is theft, and withholding wages is a form of theft. Why list them separately? Why not just say you mustn't steal? Why set out each of these prohibitions separately? And the answer the Sefer Chinuch gives is that the reason why God warns about it more than once is in order that we understand the severity of it. And therefore, it's like, when you come to a junction on a motorway, you have that countdown, the 3 marker, the 2 marker, the 1 marker, so you don't miss the junction, right? God gives us multiple warnings in order so we don't miss the point. In order it's absolutely clear to us that just as theft is wrong, so is defrauding, so is forcibly removing something from somebody, so is taking something with no intention of returning it to them, and so is failing to pay somebody on time. All of these things are forbidden, but the reason why they're set out separately is to reinforce the point to us that in case in these sort of more grey areas, people tend to deceive themselves and think, actually, it's not really theft. It's not as if I'm walking into a bank with a sawn-off shotgun. I'm just taking something that they won't notice if I take some of their produce from their field, or they can wait until the next day for me to pay them. There's nothing wrong with that. Says the Torah, no. You have to understand that this is theft, and all of these things are just as forbidden as each other. The reason why God reiterates that is in order that makes that impression upon us, and we keep away from this as much as possible. Again, we talk about Gedara and putting fences. These are fences upon fences. You don't want anyone walking on the grass. You put a fence there. You don't want anyone walk anywhere near the fence. Put a fence in front of that. This is exactly what the Torah is doing, so that we understand totally that all of these things are things which we must keep away from for all the reasons that we've seen. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you.